Do you feel like you struggle to get your ideas onto the page for your comic? Maybe your panels feel really cluttered and you feel like you're looking at a chaotic puzzle. Or maybe your action doesn't flow and the pacing feels just kind of weird. Trust me, you're not alone, and if that sounds familiar, you might be making some very common storyboarding mistakes that are holding your comic ideation back. But don't worry, because today I'm going to break down 6 of the biggest storyboarding mistakes that I think, and more importantly, how to fix them. So by the end of this video, I think you'll have some practical tools to make your comic instantly more readable, dynamic, and engaging. And also don't worry, because I did all of these things at one point too. Let's get started. The first mistake is messy panel layouts. A great comic page should guide the reader's eye smoothly from one panel to the next. But if your paneling is messy or inconsistent, it can make your page feel really confusing and super hard to follow. Some common signs of bad panel layout include panels that are too similar in size, or awkwardly placed gaps or gutters, or inconsistent spacing that makes it really unclear where to look next. A lesser known part of this is when you get a little too artistic with your panels. Don't come for me when I say this. Sometimes a lot of us choose to go a route that, rather than conveying information that should be conveyed, we choose to convey a more visual or artistic experience. And this is not bad on its own, but you should always remember that the goal should be to convey that information to your reader. So to fix your messy panel layouts in your storyboarding, you should think about your panel hierarchy. So some moments deserve bigger and more dramatic panels, while others work better with smaller and tighter frames. A large full-width panel can slow down a moment for dramatic impact, while smaller panels create a sense of urgency and quick motion. The reality is, if you find yourself getting lost reading your work, 9 times out of 10, your reader will too. The next storyboarding mistake is bad camera angles, or frankly, no camera angle changes at all. If every single panel in your comic uses the same straight-on angle, your pages are going to feel really flat and super repetitive. Sticking to basic shots can make the final iteration of your comic look more like the storyboard for an animation rather than a dynamic and engaging story. Now, with this, when you're first practicing and starting out, there's a lot to juggle, so having those simpler camera angles is totally fine while you're learning some of the other techniques. But as you start to get more comfortable, you should absolutely play around with your camera shots. And the key to this is to think like a film director. You are now a director of a movie. Mix in wide shots to establish setting, medium shots for conversations, dramatic close-ups to highlight emotions. You can use lower camera angles to make characters feel powerful, or you can use higher camera angles to make characters look vulnerable. Another thing is you want to be mindful of what's called spatial continuity here. If your characters suddenly flip directions between panels, it can be a little bit disorienting to the reader. Some people say you should follow the 180-degree rule, which is where you keep your character's position consistently so that the audience always understands where they are. But there is a lot of debate about this, so take that with a grain of salt. But ultimately, the idea here is to play around with your camera angles because they can only help you to elevate your composition and really make your reader feel in the mix with your story. The next storyboarding mistake is one that's very near and dear to my heart because I did it for probably the first 3 chapters of my manga, and that is too many dialogue-heavy panels. We have all seen it. Panels crammed with dialogue bubbles and turning the page into an entire wall of text, which slows down your pacing and makes your comic feel a little bit visually unappealing. So I think something that's interesting specifically about manga is that you want to convey a lot of information in the least amount of text, right? And this is really tricky when you're starting out, particularly if you're from a background like myself of novel writing. You kind of want to put what you want to put in the bubble. But the reality is your reader is not going to read all of that. So one thing that you could do to break up those crazy sized dialogue bubbles is to break it up across multiple panels. You could also break it up across multiple bubbles. This not only makes it easier to read, but it also adds a natural rhythm to the conversations in your comic. But most importantly, we are talking about a visual medium, right? So you should really consider visual storytelling here. Facial expressions, body language, even silence can communicate just as much as words if not more. So before adding a block of text, you should ask yourself, can I show this instead of saying it? And you should also consider, do I really need to lore dump here? Because usually the walls of text come from lore dumping. This one, I think, is one of the largest storyboarding mistakes, and it does take a little practice to get into the habit of condensing that text. But you could do it because I did too. Storyboarding mistake number 4. Characters floating in empty space. If your characters are just standing in front of blank backgrounds, then everything about your comic is going to feel lifeless. Now, let me just say this. I empathize, my fellow comic artists, with the difficulty of drawing backgrounds. And for me, in the beginning, it was a struggle. It was hard because I never did it before. I was much more comfortable drawing characters. But backgrounds do so much more than just make the scene look pretty. They establish the mood, the setting, the depth, and they convey so much information. So leaving them out is kind of like non-negotiable. One thing I also noticed from a lot of others, and something that I even did to some degree myself, is fitting a bunch of gradients and tones in the background to avoid drawing the background. You don't have to draw super hyper detailed backgrounds in every single panel. That's the trick here, right? You can have one background which is simply an establishing shot, but then in the subsequent panels, you can include basic environmental cues like furniture, props, simple shapes to suggest the space, or even just the flooring of where the characters are. Establishing shots, which are panels that show the environment before zooming in on characters, are the best way to ground your reader in the world. Then, once you've established that setting, you can reduce the complexity of your backgrounds. You could also consider using backgrounds to enhance emotion. You can show cluttered rooms to show stress, or an empty space to evoke loneliness. But the key is, in your storyboard, you do want to make sure that you always try to put some sort of environmental cue in that background if it dictates that. Don't cut corners here, guys. Like, I know I had to tell myself this, but trust me, you'll thank yourself in the long run for really flexing that muscle of drawing your backgrounds. Mistake number 5 is related to mistake number 1, which is the panel flow and layout, and that is poor speech bubble placement. Speech bubbles are supposed to make the dialogue flow naturally, but if they're placed haphazardly, they can really disrupt the entire reading experience. A common mistake is putting the bubbles in a way that forces the reader's eye to jump back and forth unnaturally across the page. Something that I've observed mangaka like Hiromashima is that they will put the dialogue bubbles onto their storyboard before they even put the pictures of the characters. They really want to nail that placement of the speech bubbles before anything else because you want to avoid this jumping back and forth for your reader. So one way you can do that is by following what's called the Z pattern if you're doing left to right or top to bottom, right to left for manga style. When you're placing the bubbles, you want to make sure that the reader's eye will flow naturally from one speaker to the next without having to stop and figure out where to go. And this is like one of the most important steps of the storyboarding phase. A big one as well is you want to avoid covering important parts of your artwork with the speech bubbles because they should complement the panel. They should not dominate it. And this is why in many cases, and for me particularly, I decide where those bubbles go before I decide where the artwork goes. A good rule of thumb is to place the bubbles somewhere near the characters' faces while leaving enough breathing room for your artwork on that panel to shine. And the final mistake is one that's in some ways less of a mistake and more a lot of people just don't know to do it. One of the most powerful tools that you have as a comic creator is called the page turner effect. And this is the moment where the reader flips to the next page and is hit with some kind of reveal. If every page that you storyboard ends on a weak note, your reader has absolutely no reason to feel excited about what's coming next in your story. So this page turner is your super special move, okay? This is like your ultimate final ogi, okay? You have to treat the last panel of each page like it's its own mini cliffhanger. But cliffhangers don't always have to be super big dramatic reveals. Sometimes it could just be a simple close-up of a character's tense expression before they respond, and that can be just as compelling. Another trick is that you can use visual setups. Like, for example, you can show a mysterious door slightly open at the end of a page, which might make the reader more eager to turn the page to see what's inside. The goal with a page turner is to keep the readers engaged and make sure that every page turn feels intentional. Now, for me, my comic is vertical scrolling, so obviously no one's turning any page, but it still applies for me too. When they get down to that last panel on that page, you don't see the bottom page yet until you scroll up. So that effect is still there. This is a very powerful tool to use as a comic artist, and I highly suggest that when you're storyboarding, you think very deeply about how to end each page to get that page turner effect. So now that you know what I think are the 6 biggest storyboarding mistakes, you can take a look at your own storyboards. Are you making any of these? I am. I still am sometimes. Don't worry if you are, because they are all things that can be fixed, and even pro artists are constantly refining their storytelling skills. I just finished storyboarding chapter 11 of my own manga, and I actually finished inking it too. So I made sure to avoid all of these mistakes while working on it. It's something I always remind myself when I'm working. If you want to see how I do that and check out the latest chapter, you can check it out on yeoldtreehouse.com. And if you want to support my work and get early access to the latest chapters, behind the scenes stuff, and character designs and all that, you can check out my Patreon, because your support helps me keep creating and sharing these resources. And before you go, let me know in the comments, which one of these mistakes do you think you struggle with the most? I would love to hear your thoughts, because we're all very different, and I want to know who among you are the background pros, because I need some help. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!